This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Erica Mena. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek.
And I'm Edward, and we're two guys with advanced degrees here to talk about comics.
That's right. And on this interview episode, Edward and I have the pleasure of talking with Erica Mena. She is the translator most recently of Paco Roca's Wrinkles. She is also the translator of a book that Edward and I spoke about last week, the anthology Spanish Fever, and we have a great time talking with her. But before we get into that conversation, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off cover price, sometimes as much as 50% off of the cover, but you know, sometimes you can find discounts that go higher than that.
Yeah, in fact, right now you can get Spanish Fever, which is a huge anthology, at 35% off for $19.49. And it's from Fantagraphics, so you know it'll be a quality book. Mm-hmm. And then you can also get Wrinkles, which we discussed this week with Erica Mena, its translator, for 35% off for only $12.99. And again, from Fantagraphics, so you know it's going to be a really nice object.
That's right. You've got great comics from a variety of different publishers at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com. They'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your books there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Edward and Derek sent you. So, Edward, we had a nice conversation with Erica about her work as a translator, as well as other topics. And, in fact, this interview came about through you because you knew Erica. And when we discovered that she was the translator of a couple of books we were interested in, you know, possibly for the Euro comic series. Now, we definitely discussed Spanish Fever, and we mentioned Wrinkles on the last show. But we thought that maybe we could hold off on our conversation on Wrinkles until we get Erica on the show, which you orchestrated.
Yeah, I've known Erica for a number of years. She wears a lot of hats. I mean, she's a poet, a translator, an editor, and for a while she was even the managing director and the executive director in succession for the American Literary Translators Association. You know, I forget exactly how I was first put in touch with her. It was probably through a mutual friend because I knew some people in the MFA translation program at the University of Iowa, which she's an alum of. But I don't think we actually formally met in person until one of the annual American Literary Translators Association conventions. And Erica was also she's always been very enterprising. She started a small press and literary magazine called Anomalous. And I remember I was living in Brussels at the time on a Fulbright when she solicited some of my translations for that. So that brought us closer together. It was mostly sort of short shorts and prose poems almost. And her first book of poetry has just come out with Ricochet Editions. So that's very exciting. It came out just last year. And right now she's teaching at Brown and also the executive director for Drunken Boat, which is an online literary magazine and literary arts organization based between Providence and New York City.
Yeah, well, you're right. She does wear quite a number of hats. We only had enough time to talk about one specific hat, her as a translator, but we were able to bring in other things as well, such as her poetry. So let's listen to what we talked about. We're pleased to have on the Comics Alternative Erica Mena. She is the translator of the book Wrinkles, which was released in July. This is by Paco Roca. Erica, welcome to the Comics Alternative.
Thanks so much.
Welcome, Erica.
Hi, Edward.
Hey. So, actually, I was wondering, since I know you originated the project of the Eternaut, which was your first major comics translation, right?
Yeah.
Did you also originate the Paco Roca book, or was it brought to you, or how did you get involved in it?
Yeah, the Roca book was sent to me by Gary Groth, who's the publisher and my editor at Fantagraphics, and I'd done at that point two projects for them. The first is the Eternaut or Eternaut, however you choose to say it, which I brought to Gary. And the second was a big anthology that it was originally called Panorama and is either out or coming out under the title Spanish Fever. Mm-hmm. And so then, after working with him on that, he's been keeping in touch with me and sending interesting projects my way. And Paco Roca is just phenomenal. So I was really delighted to have the chance to work on Wrinkles.
In fact, on this month's Eurocomics episode, Edward and I discussed Spanish Fever. And in fact, along with that, we reviewed Ezequiel Garcia's Growing Up in Public and Lucas Varela's The Longest Day of the Future. So you edited all the comics in Spanish Fever.
I did. I translated. So the anthology had already been edited in Spanish and was sent to me complete, but I translated all of the comics in Spanish Fever. It was really interesting project because the voices are so different from author to author. And I hope I was able to, capture the variety, the diversity of those voices.
Now, we had also contemplated discussing Roca's Wrinkles, but we thought we would wait until we got you on the show because as Edward and I were speculating about what we would discuss on the September show, he said, hey, I know Erica, and maybe she would want to be on the show to talk about her efforts in translating Wrinkles. So we didn't really talk about Wrinkles very much on that episode. Wanting to have you on the show to do that. So how did you first discover Wrinkles, and why was this particularly a text you wanted to bring to Fantagraphics for translation?
Well, so Fantagraphics actually brought it to me, which was really exciting. And I've now about half the projects I've done with Fantagraphics, Gary has brought them to me, which is lovely. Edward, as a translator, you know how exciting that is to get really high quality projects coming to you. And I think Gary's loved Paco Roca's work for a long time. We'd talked about the possibility of me working with them on a project, done by Roca when we had first started working together several years ago now. So I think he knew that I was interested in Roca as an artist already. So when they got the rights for it, he asked if I'd be interested in doing it. And of course I jumped at the chance. What's interesting, and you may not know, is that there was already an existent English translation of Wrinkles that had been done in the UK. So
is that the one that's called the International Edition on Amazon? I
think probably it is, although I'm not quite sure. That sounds right because I don't think Fantagraphics subtitled theirs in that way.
Do you know what publishing company did it there, or?
I could probably find out. I'm sure that it's.
Oh no, it's okay. But I had not known Roca before this, so I was really impressed because the style on display in Wrinkles is really, really different from the style of the short, mostly non-fictional short he has in Spanish Fever about the economic collapse, right? And so, I was just impressed by the breadth of the artist. But I know the late Kim Thompson would have been able to, at least, been able to read the original. Is that something Gary can do as well, or is he mostly just into him from being around the comic scene and being able to see his art and that kind of thing?
Yeah, no, Gary doesn't read Spanish. So when I think these projects come to him either through people he's worked with before, whose taste he trusts and knows that it aligns with his own aesthetics, I think certainly having Roca included in Spanish Fever gave him a little bit more access to the artist, but he definitely knew of Roca beforehand. We had talked about how great he was. So I'm not quite sure. Maybe I think Gary probably goes to Frankfurt and meets with international publishers and editors there. And there's a huge, I mean, you must already know and have discussed that there's a huge graphic lit comics and comic strip scene in Spanish in Spain. So I think, it's a really big, there's just so much work there, so much more than could ever possibly be translated, into English. So I think Gary's always sort of got an ear to that scene too.
Mm. Well, you had mentioned a previous British translation of Wrinkles. When it comes
by Knockabout, I see.
Knockabout. Well, so Erica, when it comes to translating something that has previously been translated, what are the things that you need to keep in mind? What are the protocols you take? In other words, how much do you attend to that original translation?
Yeah, I think it's different from translator to translator. But for me, I don't look at the existent translation at all before I finish the project. I haven't done a lot of work that has already existed in English. And I also translate poetry, so it's a little bit different for me in poetry than it is in graphic lit. But with graphic lit, I'm going to be doing another project that I can't really say much about, but parts of it have been translated beforehand, and so I had to have this conversation with the editor that I don't want to see the other translators' choices until I have made my own. But then afterwards, because translation is a series of choices and a lot of those are subjective and aesthetic, and even in relatively non-sci-fi text like Wrinkles, you're going to come up with invented language or, poetic turns of phrase, things that have many, many possibilities for translation. After I've made my best choice, I like to see what the other translator did. And not in the case of Wrinkles, but in other cases, I've definitely borrowed from the other translation. Often, if I have the chance to, I'll talk to the other translator as well, and we can talk about the process. And that's something that I really love about the translation community, is that I think we tend to be very generous with each other because there aren't very many of us doing it. So.
Because I had always wondered if something was translated originally, does that set a precedent that maybe an unspoken assumption would be that needs to be honored?
Yeah, I wonder. I think it's so different from project to project. And I talked to Gary about why he wanted a new translation for Wrinkles, and because I hadn't read the existent translation, but I knew that it was out there. And he said that he had his reasons, I guess. I don't want to speak for him. So I was just happy to do it. And I don't know the translator for Wrinkles, and I don't know them individually. I don't have a relationship with them. So I would hate to say anything about the translation that made it sound like it's not, marketable, or, it's clearly a good translation. But there are always multiple ways to read a text. And so getting more than, I think actually in a way, the more translations of a text we have, the better access to the text we get as readers. So if you're somebody who really loves the text Wrinkles, read both of the translations. There's no definitive way to translate anything, even the most basic sort of, simple, you'd think there's only one way to read it. Nouns can have so many contexts and resonances and multiplicities of meaning within a literary text. I think honoring the work of the other translator maybe is really important, but also I'm loath to think of anything as being definitive or final or, unassailable, because there are always choices.
Yeah, no, I'd absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think some of the ways in which translators are working for visibility, which is something we've discussed earlier on this show before, is this idea that, that perhaps the old ideals of fidelity and invisibility as absolutes, or maybe that's an old paradigm, and that like we could maybe think of these things more as like the translator can't help but put a subjective spin on it, and therefore almost like a cover of a song, so that no one's mistaking that person for being the writer of the song, but many variant covers can exist, coexist. But that said, I think the few times in comics when I've been asked to retranslate something, I've actually had to take pains not to use too much of the existing translation, because from what I gather, I was asked to redo it because not because the original, the pre-existing translation was always bad. That hardly was true. I think it was because the pre-existing translation was somehow still under copyright, so they couldn't simply reprint it. Right. But they were somehow able to access the rights to the French books again to get a new translation. So even though that old translation was out of print, it was maybe still available, used or something. But then I had to be careful not to lift too much from the original, because I do tend to consult the originals as well. Maybe not for my first draft, but in the process, it's really, I'm actually facing that with the novel I'm doing right now. It's really annoying, or it can be really annoying when someone else has found what really does seem like an excellent solution, and you have to not use it.
Oof, I haven't had that happen yet, thankfully. Or maybe I have and I didn't know it. But rights are so complicated when you're translating. I can't imagine having to give up sort of an ideal solution because of an issue with the rights.
Well, one of the things that I find fascinating about Roca's Wrinkles is how moving it is. And for me, it's moving because of some things that have gone on with me and my father over the past several months. And I know that this is a question that I have addressed to Edward in the past, but Erica, I'm wondering, when you're translating something like this, a really powerful narrative, how difficult is it for you to detach yourself from the story itself, from getting too enmeshed emotionally in what's going on in doing the translation? Or is it kind of easy for you to kind of fall under the sway, under the lure of a text? Because I swear this, God, it's just so sad the way it ends. Really moving.
Oh, it really is. Yeah. I mean, I think I tend to want to fall under the sway of a text. I don't want any sort of distance, emotional distance between me and the text. I find that the closer I am to it, the better I am able to produce work that I'm happy with in English. And there's that sort of, and I'm sure Edward can talk about this too, that sort of idea that, there's always this like sort of ineffable quality to a really great text that has some, it has to do with the emotional impact on the reader. And that's what I'm trying to reproduce in English. So if I don't have immediate experience of that, it becomes much harder to do. And with Wrinkles, I mean, I was weeping while I was translating. And I remember some nights where I was up late. I tend to work very well late at night. And luckily I was on the East Coast and I have some good friends on the West Coast who are still awake. And I was, chatting with them just, I would have to take a break every couple of pages and just like weep with my friends. It's a really moving work. But I think if I didn't have that emotional reaction to it, I don't know that I could have done the job that I would have wanted to with it. But I really needed to give myself some self-care moments in the middle of that. There were a couple of times where at like 2 a.m, I was like, I just really just need to like cuddle with my cat and eat some ice cream right now. And try not to think of my grandmother who, passed away 2 years ago, and she and I were really close, and I was thinking of her a lot during the translation of this text. But that emotional level of it, right, I think is so important.
Yeah, and also, I mean, one of the most striking things for me about it was how seamlessly it slips in and out of the characters' subjective spaces or imagined worlds or their headspace, and it was extra endearing, I guess, for that. I mean, also at times devastating, but the way I mean, I think the way it embodies what the individuals are seeing is that's maybe like there's a fluidity to that that's maybe native to a visual medium that I think is really impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing that struck me about Wrinkles concerns the character Miguel, because he comes across for most of the story as a con man, and so you don't have, at least at first, or I didn't have, much sympathy for him. But what was, I guess, almost as powerful as Emilio's story and how he ends up is where Miguel ends up in his situation and the way that he interacts with others.
Yeah, Miguel, I think, is a great character. You really do hate him at the beginning. And even still at the end a little bit. Like, I don't think he's completely redeemed. But I think that's part of what makes it a really interesting person to read about, that he's not completely sympathetic or completely hateable. He's this complex, nuanced, sort of fully embodied character.
It's interesting in that, one of the things that I've always found interesting is when on talk shows, you have actors who are asked how they would interpret a particular character that they play. And, on the one hand, I think, well, isn't that something that really you should ask the author of that piece, right? The screenplay, because they're the ones who have a particular vision for this. But you are asking an actor to give his or her take on the translation of that role. Now, is that something similar to, for instance, what you were just doing in your take on Miguel?
Yeah, maybe. Sorry, it's interesting that too. There's a movie of Wrinkles as well, and I don't know if you have seen it. I haven't seen it yet, and I wanted to. I had it. I bought it while I was translating, and I thought I would watch it, and then I couldn't. In part because I didn't, want to be influenced in the way that we were talking about before, but with the interpretations of the characters, and in part because the story ended up being so difficult and so emotional to work on. But yeah, I mean, I think like every choice that you're making at the level of language, at the level of syntax, builds to a reading of a character. And so, the choice between even using contractions or not using contractions, which is a choice that often we have to make in English, where that choice wasn't available in the original language, sets the tone and sets the interpretation for the character. So yeah, no, I mean, I didn't get a chance. I mean, I've never spoken to Paco Roca, and I don't know whether or not he's read my translation, what he thinks of it. I would be very interested to know those things if I read Miguel the way that he did.
Well, that's interesting, because I was wondering, and Edward, the same thing with you. I mean, how often is it that you will translate someone's work and then it goes back to the original author for their review and critique and maybe recommendations for changes?
Well, I think that really depends on the author's capacity to, or how well they function in English. Mm-hmm. But I saw that probably varies from author to author. I don't know what that would be in this case for you, Erica.
I actually don't know what Roca's proficiency in English is, and in this case, it went straight to Fantagraphics. They edited it. I didn't even see it until it was published again. So
they didn't give you a PDF proof or something?
No. No,
oh, okay.
It was a really fast turnaround.
Yeah, sure. No, yeah. That's common in comics as well. But it's interesting because I know you did a piece for Words Without Borders where you were talking about your translation of the Eternaut and how you had to strike a different adopt different strategies / strike a different tone between the narration, because there is a lot heavier use of narration in that and the dialogue, which was different. And I mean, Wrinkles is all dialogue, but I think that is something I do think about a lot in comics, is how to individuate character voices, but to also make them somehow of a piece so that it doesn't feel like people stepped in from different stories and they're talking. Like there is some kind of overriding tone somehow at the same time that or maybe it's a matter of register to some degree, but yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I actually, when I was working on the Eternaut, I actually had a sort of chart of characters and voices and the narration and different choices that I was making to tonally differentiate between those voices. With Wrinkles, because it's all dialogue and because I didn't actually need the same kind of I don't want to imply that it was a less complicated series of choices, but for some reason Wrinkles came more easily to me in terms of like, I knew when I was reading it, I knew how Emilio sounded. And so I could write that relatively easily. I knew how Miguel sounded in my, it was, those voices became so clear to me right away, that I ended up making very consistent choices, throughout, in terms of, setting the register for them. It was not as easy for me in the Eternaut.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thing. Does that happen to you in poetry as well? Because I do think there are definitely, because because I make my living translation, I do get translating. I do get a lot of stuff where I read it and it's like I really have to work to hear it. Whereas there are things that I bring people or submit to journals or whatnot where it's like, oh, you read it and you do hear it. You actually. It is this weird ghostly voice that you hear how it should go, how you think it should go.
Yeah.
Almost at once. That's a strange feeling. I don't know if it,
Yeah. And what's interesting to me is it's been almost the opposite. I tend to pick projects where I have a lot more difficulty with it. And when I'm brought a project, it's often something that I can sort of slip right into. And I wonder, I don't know. I hadn't thought about that before, but I wonder if that's indicative of the kinds of projects I'm choosing, maybe.
Were there major differences between the more contemporary Spanish of Roca versus the less contemporary Argentinian Spanish?
Yeah, for sure. So Argentine Spanish is pretty different from most other Spanishes. Even Spain, it's probably closer to Spain Spanish than most other Latin American Spanishes, because they use the vosotros form, which is the third person formal plural. So actually, I might have just said that wrong, but it's a form of the verb that most Latin American Spanishes don't use, and it didn't. Sorry, it's interesting. I just finished another project for Fantagraphics in which the vosotros form was used, like almost only that form was used, and that got to be a sort of strange music in my head because the verb ending is ais, and everything sort of ends up sounding more lilting when you've got everything ending with ais. But I don't think Spain Spanish, this particular Wrinkles was not. It wasn't particularly difficult in that way. There also wasn't a lot of slang in it, which is something that I dealt with in Panorama or Spanish Fever. That there was a lot of slang, a lot of regional slang as well. So I ended up, having this huge list of questions that I had to find, not even just native Spain Spanish speakers, but like native Spain Spanish speakers from this particular city, to like understand. Yeah. So and none of those things came up in Wrinkles.
But so, I know Derek and I talked on the last show when we talked about Spanish Fever, we talked about some of our favorites. Do you have some favorite stories from there that stand out just in your head? How long ago was it that you did it?
So it was 2 years ago.
Wow.
Wow. That's
yeah. And I'm actually just looking on my computer now to open up the PDF. I definitely did have some favorite stories. But it might take me quite a bit to find them. There's one, I can sort of describe it, and perhaps somebody who's read it more recently, there's one that's sort of set in a dystopian future world. It's all in black and white. I think it maybe is Colodex de Santiago of Valenzuela, because I love sci-fi. And
Colodex. Okay, right. Okay.
Yeah.
The one with the really a lot of text, actually.
A ton of text and a lot of made up words that are sort of based in it's like it's a near reality set text. So there are these sort of allusions to Babylon and Zoroastrian civilizations, but then it's not not drawing on those traditions exactly. It departs from them to make it a sort of richer sci-fi fantasy world. So it's actually one of the more complicated texts in the book. So this is what I tend to pick texts that are harder because I tend to like difficult sci-fi for my own reading preferences.
Yeah, I think one of our remarks last week was that for Derek was that it seemed to that was one that seemed to gesture at a world outside the actual pages.
Yeah, exactly.
That were supplied like that. That really seemed to. There seemed to be a lot that was like the tip of some iceberg that we hadn't seen the rest
right.
of.
One of the things I said was that I just got the feeling that this was part of a larger text, that when I came to it, I felt that there's stuff that I'm not getting, that I don't have access to. And so I felt a little lost there.
Yeah, I did too when I was translating it, and I actually haven't seen any more of it than what was in this anthology. But if and when I ever get to pitch another project, I think this is a strong contender for me. I really love the world, and if it seems like it's part of an enormous and complex world that I would love to immerse myself in.
Now, you say you never got to speak with Roca. Did you ever get to speak with any of the authors in this one, or was the production process very similar? Kind of fast, and you.
This one I actually had a lot more time on, thank goodness, because it was longer and more complicated with so many different authors. But I didn't interact with any of the authors directly. I did have a wonderful series of interactions with the editors at Fantagraphics, and so I would pass queries to them, and they would get them to the editors of the original Spanish anthology, and then they would come back with answers for me. And I do have some friends that translate graphic lit into Spanish. So I was able to sort of go that route and talk, sort of get questions to various people when they were harder to track down through the editors. But I didn't actually have any direct conversations with any of the authors here. But I did have queries, so.
No, sorry. And you were talking about how geographically specific this slang could be. And also that in my mind connected somehow to an earlier thing you were saying about how vibrant the comic scene is in contemporary Spain. Have you spent any time in it? Like, is it centered around any one particular city, or are there different scenes in different cities? Is it centered around a couple large publishers? What's your general?
I've only really begun to learn about it starting with this anthology with Spanish Fever, because I had focused on Latin America before. I was focused on Argentina primarily. And so reading and translating this, it seems to me that it's organized around a couple of journals, Barcelona and Madrid being the two centers, the larger cities, and the centers of cultural production. And that the scene really got, sort of exploded in the 80s with, a handful of independent journals, comic journals and magazines that were being published, sort of, very locally and independently within these scenes, within those cities, and then sort of became institutionalized or became, commercialized, perhaps is the better word, from there. So it seems to me, and I'm not an expert on the Spanish scene, so perhaps this is going to sound wrong to people who live in Spain if anyone listens. But it seemed to me like it was really a very sort of informal community-based scene that sort of built a movement that became sort of commercialized in larger productions and publishing houses like through the 90s. But there's still that sense of like when I was translating this anthology, there were so many points of connection between the contributors that it seemed like they probably all know each other. Which I think is very much like the translation community here in the U.S. actually. Mm-hmm.
Now, Erica, you've mentioned a few times your work on the Eternaut, and I've noticed that you've pronounced it Eternaut or Eternaut. I'm curious. I've heard a lot of people, I pronounce it Eternaut, but I've heard a lot of other people pronounce it in English Eternaut. Do you have a preference? Is there one correct?
There is no correct pronunciation. And it's a really interesting question. The title. So in Spanish, of course, it's el Eternaut, which is, it's a neologism and it's a portmanteau. So it's a neologism composed of two words that are actual words. So éter is the prefix, and it means ether, in that sort of like mystical element that, you know, supposedly fills the void in space, the ether. But it's also the root for eternidad, eternity. And then not is a suffix, and we have it as a cognate in English: cosmonaut, astronaut, argonaut, right? So not is pretty familiar to us, but éter or ether is, so when I originally translated it, I translated it as Eternaut, with an extra O. So Eternonaut. Because I thought that would be easier to pronounce in English. And we had huge discussions with Gary and the editors and the rights holders, who are the heirs to the Oesterheld, his grandchildren, some various scholars who had made, you know, careers studying this work in English and in Spanish. So we had a lot of different opinions about how to deal with that in English. And in the end, we went with Eternaut, which is how I pronounce it, E-T-E-R. And I pronounce it Eternaut because one of my main arguments for Eternaut was, if you say it Eternaut, it sounds like somebody's grandmother is like force feeding you spaghetti. So that wasn't, you know, didn't have quite the right ring to my ear in English anyway. So like, are you going to eat or not? Right? That's not that, right? In my mind was one of the potential problems with what we ended up going with. But so I say it Eternaut, but that's clearly not a comfortable thing to say in English. So it's one of those really tricky things with, you know, lots of potential solutions. None of them are perfect.
This is interesting in that it wasn't until just several years ago that I learned about the Eternaut. And before that, I was completely ignorant of it. But the more I learned about it, the more I learned that this was a Spanish language comics classic. Mm-hmm. And yours is the first translation into English. Is that correct?
Yeah, the first published translation in English.
Right. So I'm wondering, I mean, for this to be the classic that it is, why did it take so long for us to get a translation like yours?
Yeah, the rights, actually.
Really?
The
as
rights
mundane
were very
a reason as that.
Yeah, it really is. And I think this is, you know, a big conversation in the translation community. I spend a lot of time thinking about intellectual property rights as an artist and as a translator. We would have had a translation 30 years ago, you know, if it hadn't been for difficulty with copyright. I'm sure of it. And I think I just had the great fortune of being in the right place at the right time and getting to meet the right people, the people who could make this project happen. I don't think that I was, you know, I don't think that there's anything exceptional about me. I just happened to be in the right place to get all of the pieces to fall together to get it to happen.
Yeah, because it was, I think, back in 2010, I was at a conference hosted by the University of Naples. We were on the island of Procida, and I met a guy named Fernando Ariel Garcia from Argentina, and he has done a lot of work on the Eternaut. He told me about it. He even sent me a copy of his book on the Eternaut, all in Spanish, and I can't read Spanish, unfortunately.
Oh, it's a great book, though. But I read it.
Oh, so you know, yeah, and he really whetted my appetite about this text, so I was really excited about a year and a half ago when I heard that we were finally going to get an English language translation.
Oh, that's so great to hear. Thank you.
And I contacted Fernando about that and said, yes, I'm excited.
Yeah, I think this text has a lot of advocates. I mean, it is really, it's hard to overstate the importance it has in Spanish language comics. It is one of the classics, one of the greats, one of the seminal pieces. And I think even, translations don't tend to sell all that well, and we've now sold out 2 runs of the book, and I think I hope it's going into a 3rd run, so that it'll continue to be available in English. It's just exceptional, the reception that it's had. Although I've had to be really careful not to look on fan sites and fan boards, because I did at the very beginning, and it just broke my heart because people were, picking apart every decision I had made. So it was a little too intense for me to see, my decisions, parsed in that way.
Is that the only occasion where you've been a little sensitive, or at least, you've been aware of comments on your translations?
I've definitely been most aware of it with the Eternaut because of its fan base.
Okay.
I think, because it is such an important work to so many people, all of whom have very strong opinions about how it can and might be rendered in a different cultural context, in a different linguistic context. And I have to be careful when I'm talking about it, because I really do believe that there's no sort of absolute right or absolute wrong here, that they're all a set of informed decisions. But I spent 3 years, studying the Eternaut, working on the translation, working with Gary to secure the rights. And it was pretty much the only project I worked on during that time. So I'm very, very, invested in it. Perhaps more so than I have been with anything else I've done. So yeah, so that's the only one where I've become aware of the criticisms, and they've really sort of, they've been a little bit difficult for me to hear.
Well, what are some of those criticisms that maybe that you think are the most serious, or the ones that you take closest to heart?
Well, the title was probably the hardest, because I worked so hard and I loved my solution. And in the end, I didn't win that conversation. So I think, I think it was a really interesting conversation to have. And I'm not at all unhappy with where we ended. I just was very attached to my solution.
Mm-hmm.
So that's probably, that's probably the one that has, I find it so interesting. I always, it comes up a lot because it's obviously the most important word in the entire book. And, it comes up a lot in the book. It's used a lot. So, but there have been other things. There was one conversation I had. There's a scene, about 2/3 of the way through, where we first encounter the gerbos. There's, huge, 4-legged animals that are sort of, controlled and
Right.
driven,
Mm-hmm.
for lack of a better word, by the hands. And the size of the gerbo is described in Spanish as being the size of an apartment building. But I decided to change that in English to being the size of a department store, because for so much of at least the US, apartment buildings don't have the same scale as they would in Buenos Aires. So an apartment building in Buenos Aires is a much different physical scale than it is in, say, Iowa or Indiana or Michigan even, right? So, so that was about context and audience. And so then I got some people being like, oh, she's such a terrible translator. She didn't even understand that the word departamento means apartment and not department store. And I was like, no, I did understand. Of course I did. I just made a different decision. So I think when, people are criticizing translations and they haven't maybe spent a lot of time working as a translator or thinking about translation theory, they sometimes ascribe things to mistakes that are decisions, and those can always be a little hurtful, right? You're like, hey, no, I do so know that word, right? But
now you and Edward know each other as translators, and I'm wondering if, I'm sure that you guys have had conversations about your various philosophies. So I'm curious, how would you guys compare your philosophies of translation?
whoa.
Is that too broad a question?
I actually am not sure I could tell you what Edwards is. So how about you tell us what yours is, and I'll tell you what mine is.
Oh, it's one of these.
No, actually, the funny thing is, I was going to ask something similar to it, only but like from the angle more that Erica, you are a poet and also translate poetry, and I primarily translate prose, and I was going to sort of compare those since we meet in the middle on comics.
Right.
What if anything you bring from the translation of poetry to comics, or vice versa? What if anything comics seems to call on from your experience doing poetry? But I don't know that we've ever talked about our translation philosophies, and mine has definitely developed. I mean, I think it really is so contextual, but I suppose because I'm largely self-taught and I haven't studied French at a formal level or translation, I guess if there was just a trend overworking in the last decade, it would just be taking more informed liberties, I don't just mean taking informed liberties more often, but also taking liberties that are more informed, more assured. I guess I think I did sort of cling to the when I look back on the earlier things I did, I see myself clinging to a certain literalist draft for lack of any other reachable object or flotsam.
It's like a life raft.
Life raft and then it really has been and also because I've been working in, I think a lot of times with small presses and or comics presses that you don't have the staff or the schedule to really give you an edit or even just someone who doesn't. People are often afraid to edit translations because they feel like they don't know the original language, and that's actually probably not something that should stand in people's way. I tend to encourage editors when I can, but like as a result, I do feel like I've had sort of like quantum leaps when I get a really good edit, and and those have always opened my eyes, and they've been sort of few and far between, but also spaced out in a good way, I guess. So then
Yeah, that's interesting too, that the impact of having a good edit. And I've definitely had the same experience that a lot of editors I've worked with are reluctant to edit translations because they can't consult the original. And so then they feel like they don't have the authority to make editorial suggestions, which I always try to discourage them from feeling that way. But yeah, I would say that my theory, or my sort of driving theory of translation, is the sort of infinite possibility of literary texts, which because I have a background in literary theory, this is all going to start sounding really pretentious and bougie, but whatever. It is what I have. And it does come from poetry and from the openness of poetry, as a linguistic form that, every word has a multiplicity of readings, and that those readings are not fixed by the author. So this idea of authorial intent, I find to be very problematic, because the more we read a text and in the context in which we read it informs that, the meaning of that text changes. And that's one of the things that I think qualifies a text for literary greatness. So multiple translations, multiple possibilities. Like in my fantasy world, there would be some sort of like translation engine that could generate sort of the infinite multiplicity of every possible translation choice. Like I would love to see some kind of like digital art project that does that with a text, that just takes like a very small piece of text and generates an infinite number of generations of text from it. But
it would also generate an infinite number of criticisms to go with.
Exactly, it sure would. Right. So I find that especially with comics, I sort of have to rein myself back in to the text. I have to swim closer to Edward's lifeboat of literalism before I get sort of swept away in like the sort of theoretical pleasure of infinite linguistic possibility. And comics has helped me with that, I think, actually, to like go back to Edward's question about, where poetry and comics intersect and how the one informs the other for me, that, I find poetry, having a background in poetry helps me with comics because I'm used to thinking about constrained form. And so like the constraint of line breaks and stanza breaks actually functions really similarly to balloon text and panels and page breaks in the comic form. So there's a sense of like rhythm and pausing and of the pacing of the narration really depends on those things. And so I'm used to thinking about text being constrained in that way in poetry. And then doing comics helps me sort of rein my poetry back down to some sort of recognizable iteration of the source text.
Well, Erica, what are you working on now, translation-wise? Anything that you can tell us, or things at a stage where you can't say much?
I think I can. I might actually have to just double check before I'll email Gary and make sure that I can.
That's okay. You don't have to reveal anything on the podcast.
Okay. I mean, so there is something that I just finished, which I'm really excited about. It's a book called Las Meninas. And it's about, it's a Spain Spanish, written by Santiago Garcia and illustrated by Javier Olivares, or I might have actually gotten that backwards. Let's see. Those are the two people. Let's see who's the illustrator.
But that's the editor of Spanish Fever.
Yeah. So I got that right. Santiago wrote it and Javier illustrated it. And it's going to be coming out with Fantagraphics, I think, early next year. And it is phenomenal. It is so beautiful and so dense. And it's a sort of, fictional history, around the life of Diego Velázquez, the very famous Spanish painter who painted Las Meninas, which is like one of the most famous works of, art, maybe in Europe, definitely in Spain, and about the influence that he's had sort of on Spanish art history. It's phenomenal. It's so good. And the art is just stunning. So I just finished that, last week, and I'm really excited for it to come out. It's beautiful.
Yeah, that sounds incredible. I've been doing a lot of artist bios for one British publisher, from French, graphic artist bios in comics form. So that sounds really terrific. I can't wait to see it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if our listeners wanted to find out more about your work, your books, your own writing, your translation, and your teaching, what website should we direct them to? And also to learn about your apparent love of cats.
It's true. I am the stereotype of a cat lover on the internet. So I'm everywhere online. I am a cyborg kitty. So my website is www.acyborgkitty.com. It's cyborg kitty, a cyborg kitty on Instagram and on Twitter. So yes, all about my love of cats and literature.
And let's say a rather animated,
sure.
an appropriate word, love of cats. And if our listeners wonder why that word's appropriate, well, just go to a cyborgkitty.com and you'll see what I'm talking about.
Thanks.
Yeah. Erica, thank you very much for taking the time and talking with me and Edward for the Comics Alternative.
A pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, well, that was terrific. I had a really good time.
Yeah, it was fun talking with her about some of the choices that she was making when she was translating Roca's Wrinkles, as well as various pieces in Spanish Fever, which is similar to some conversations that you and I have had about some of the decisions that you make as a translator of French texts.
Well, I really appreciate some of your questions because, as you can tell, you asked us things that we've never talked about with each other before. And said it was full of good firsts.
Wow. Well, that's what the Comics Alternative is all about, bringing people together. So, yeah, we had a good time talking with Erica. We thank her again for being on the show, and we look forward to reading more of her work in the future. And if you want to find great books like the ones that Erica translates, well, head on over to the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. As Edward mentioned at the top of the show, you can find 2 of her recent translations at 35% off the cover price. That's the anthology Spanish Fever and Paco Roca's Wrinkles. And after you do get your books there, please be sure to get in touch with us and let us know what you think about our interview with Erica. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message easily enough through SpeakPipe. Or you can get in touch with us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Or you can email us at 2guys@comicsalternative.com or email me, Edward, directly at edward@comicsalternative.com.
And you can email me at derek@comicsalternative.com. You can also get in touch with us via social media. We're all over the place, such as Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. You can listen to us on Spotify and iHeartRadio. And if you're an Android user, Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is comicsalternative.com. So there are a lot of ways for people to get in touch with us, and we like to hear from you. Maybe you can send me and Edward an email recommending some European comics for us to talk about in future episodes.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. And until next time, I'm Derek.
I'm Edward. So long.